Hey everyone, welcome to this particular edition of History with Sai. In this program, we're going to take a look at the Mycenaean civilization of Bronze Age Greece. Had it not been for the Mycenaeans, Greece as we know it may never have existed. If that sounds interesting to you, stick around. Mycenaean civilization is the term historians use for the early culture that sprung up on the Greek mainland between the years 1600 to about 12,000 BCE. Those who made up this civilization, called Mycenaeans, were considered to be a warrior society whose rise and fall were well before that of the ancient Greece that many of us are familiar with, namely classical Greece. Now, to the classical Greeks of the 400s BCE, the Mycenaeans were their legendary ancestors who belonged to a mythical age of heroes far in the past. They were immortalized in stories such as Jason and the Argonauts, and of course, Homer's great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I'm sure you've heard the story of the Iliad, the one about King Agamemnon, Helen of Troy, and the Trojan War. That story is said to have taken place during the Mycenaean era of ancient Greece. They're not just the stuff of stories and legends. Being contemporaries of the Hittites, Arzawa, Luvians, Egyptians, and early Canaanites, the Mycenaeans are one of the great civilizations to emerge from the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. The term Mycenaean was first used by the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann in 1876 to describe this civilization. He called it this because traces of it were first discovered at the site called Mycenae in the Peloponnese of mainland Greece. Later on, similar artifacts and structures were found at other sites, including Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Orchomenos, and even Athens, the capital of modern Greece. Many of these artifacts, such as pottery, jewelry, intricate stone carvings, and armor, were found in what appear to be the tombs of rulers and the remains of ancient palaces and citadels. Some sites have also yielded a form of primitive writing inscribed on clay tablets. Simply named Linear B by archaeologists, these texts have proven quite valuable in providing a glimpse of what everyday life in Mycenaean society may have been like. Is it the stuff of epic legend? No. For the most part, these Linear B tablets consist of inventory lists for objects such as livestock, foodstuffs, and weapons. All of these may not seem like much, but when you combine them with a further analysis of Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, a more comprehensive understanding of Mycenaean culture and society takes shape. Of course, both of these epics were written down several centuries after Mycenaean civilization collapsed, so one has to be a bit cautious when using this approach. Now, we've stated that the Mycenaeans were the ancestors of the ancient Greeks, but who were the ancestors of the Mycenaeans? Scholars believe that they were the descendants of Indo-European tribes who arrived in the Greek mainland from the Danube region around 2100 BCE. They were mostly nomads and slowly began penetrating southward, deeper into the Peloponnese. There were already people living here, and they without a doubt influenced these Indo-European, we'll say, early Greek-speaking tribes. From the original inhabitants, these Greek nomads learned many of the skills that would later on be useful to them as they adopted settled life. For example, better farming techniques, masonry, and, what was especially useful in the Aegean region, shipbuilding. Archaeologists and historians believe that this cross-cultural mixing went on for about 500 years or so, until approximately 1600 BCE, when the culture we call Mycenaean became firmly established across the Greek peninsula. By this time, the Mycenaeans had clearly developed into a sophisticated and very wealthy society. This can be seen actually by several of the tombs of their rulers. There are at least 6 such tombs that have been found amongst the ruins of Mycenae. Known as Grave Circle A, they have been dated by archaeologists to the years 1550 to 1500 BCE. The graves not only show the great wealth of these early rulers, but also reveal that Mycenaean civilization was by no means an isolated one. Though many of the objects found may have been produced locally, the raw materials and metals used likely came from areas across the Mediterranean Sea, such as Anatolia, Canaan, and Egypt. Based on the evidence uncovered, it seems that the Mycenaeans were divided up into several major and minor kingdoms. For the most part, these kingdoms were situated on the major farming plains of mainland Greece. The most powerful of these was Mycenae on the plain of Argos. Other such cities included Pylos, Thebes, Orchomenos, and Iolcos. There were several other smaller cities and kingdoms dotting the peninsula as well. Now, it's hard to get scholars in the field to construct and agree upon a definitive history of Mycenaean civilization simply out of ruined cities and epic poetry. However, one event, or perhaps a series of events, that practically all of them do agree upon is that by around the year 1450 BCE, the Mycenaeans had invaded the island of Crete and taken over Knossos, the greatest city of Minoan civilization. The Mycenaeans, though, didn't stay too long on Crete. By 1400 BC, they were mostly gone. Though it may seem like they wasted time conquering and then leaving, it's likely that their brief occupation of Crete allowed them to learn many useful things from the Minoans. For example, knowledge of improved architectural techniques was likely transferred to Mycenaean civilization from the Minoans. The evidence of this being improvements in Mycenaean palaces and similar architectural styles shortly after their conquest of Crete. They also seem to use a variant of the Minoan Linear A script, which for the Mycenaeans we call Linear B. Thus, the years 1400 to 1200 BCE were years of great advancement and prosperity for the Mycenaeans, in no small part due to the technologies and wealth that they acquired from their Minoan neighbors. According to the Linear B tablets found in the ruins of various palaces, scholars have determined that Mycenaean society was ruled by a king called a Wanax. From what we can tell, the Wanax lived a pretty good life in a pretty big palace. If he was living in a place such as Mycenae, he had large defensive walls surrounding his city. However, not all Mycenaean cities had such walls. What they did have were small industrial centers where craftsmen, artisans, metalworkers, weavers, and others created finished goods made from the raw materials that most often came from overseas trade. The most prized raw materials from this trade were copper and tin, two elements needed for creating bronze. In fact, Mycenaean traders ventured far and wide to acquire these. One example of this is the mineral-rich island of Cyprus, where there's actually evidence of Mycenaean trading colonies. The king and his capital were surrounded by several villages and farms whose people paid him with taxes, mostly in the form of crops and foodstuffs they'd produced, but also sometimes with wool. In return, it was the king's job to protect them from attack. Now, as mentioned before, Mycenaean society was believed to have been a militant one whose kings commanded sizable armies of heavy infantry. Their soldiers wore breastplates and helmets made of bronze. As raw materials and resources in their homeland were relatively scarce, Mycenaean kings used their armies to protect what they had, as well as to plunder from others. The Minoans are just one example. There's little doubt that the Mycenaeans conquered and took from others as they island hopped around the Aegean and looted cities along the coast of what is today modern Turkey. In fact, there are Linear B tablets from Mycenaean cities that contain lists of slaves with names of Anatolian origin. By about the year 1250 BCE, Mycenaean societies were becoming negatively impacted by events to their east. The Hittite Empire was rapidly on the decline, and along with this, waves of migrants called by historians the Sea Peoples were swarming all over the lands of the eastern Mediterranean. This caused a great amount of instability that no doubt affected the economies of the Mycenaean kingdoms. It's not known exactly what happened to bring about the end of Mycenaean civilization. One can just hypothesize about what happened due to the many events that were going on at the time. As often happens during troubled times, political unrest sets in. There are several scenarios of what may have happened, but one of the more popular theories goes like this. Due to the unrest and instability surrounding them, the Mycenaean kingdoms and cities turned against each other and fought for several decades. This resulted in catastrophe for many of them. Archaeological evidence shows that by 1200 BCE, the cities of Mycenae, Thebes, and Pylos had been destroyed. The infighting and destruction created a political vacuum that by 1100 BCE allowed tribes of Dorian Greeks from the north to enter the Peloponnese and settle in the war-torn lands of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Now, at one time, it was thought that these Dorian Greeks facilitated the demise of Mycenaean civilization, but now, scholars seem to refute this and argue that they actually just took advantage of events and entered the area only after the political authority of the various Wanaxes collapsed. I actually like the way that historian Philip Matizak describes it, and I'm going to quote him here. Every ancient city unearthed by archaeologists in Greece reveals a destruction layer dated to this period. Whatever happened to these cities in the last decades of the 11th century BC included burning, looting, and corpses left unburied in the streets. The survivors of the catastrophe huddled in isolated valleys and hilltop forts. Over the following decades, the art of writing was lost, and trade became a matter of barter between local villages. So, as we can see, the situation was bad, but it doesn't mean that Mycenaean culture completely disappeared. Historians do believe that it survived in the countryside and villages outside of the once great cities. However, rather than the large wealthy kingdoms of the past, what remained of Mycenaean society was little more than a group of fiefdoms with petty rulers at their head. The Mycenaeans, though, have lived on in the memories of the Greeks and really Western civilization up until this very day. We still read Homer's Iliad, which is about the legendary Trojan War, and also the Odyssey. Both are two of the most famous, important, and foundational works of Western literature. And of course, we have their monumental artwork that's been left behind for future generations to marvel at. Though a so-called Dark Age followed them, the Mycenaeans did create the foundations for Greek civilization that most of us are familiar with today. So that wraps up this particular program. I hope you learned something new about Mycenaean civilization, and if you did, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. I'll be posting new videos as fast as I can. Thanks once again for stopping by, I really appreciate it, and have a great day.